Welcome to the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. You are about to listen to an episode of the Audio Signals podcast with Marco Ciappelli. In this new season, Audio Signals is repositioning its antennas, focusing not just on the stories, but on the storytellers. In our modern hybrid analog-digital society, the art of storytelling has never been more vital or displayed such a diverse array of forms. Recognizing this, our conversations will spotlight the narrators, providing a unique exploration into the minds behind the narratives. From authors to podcasters, visual artists to songwriters, and everything in between, we will engage with all who contribute to this extraordinary tapestry of human experience. We are all made of stories, after all.
All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Audio Signals podcast. We are here today to talk about stories and storytellers. This is what we do on this show of mine. The other one is Little Advertising, Redefining Society, where we talk about society and technology. And to be honest, sometimes I'm in between. I got to decide if a guest is going to go on one show or another. This could definitely be on that show as well, because it's certainly about redefining society. It's certainly about using technology as well. But I felt like it was more important from a storytelling perspective, and how by telling story in a certain way, maybe leveraging musician, actors, and influencers, and so on, we can really make some changes in the world. And I'm not the one doing that. I mean, I just have conversation. I hope somebody listen and think and act. But I have Michael Sheldrick here with me. He's the co-founder of Global Citizen. He just wrote a book called From Ideas to Impact, a playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world. So that's an entire episode right there. And that's what we're gonna talk about. Michael, thank you for joining me. I'm very, very happy to have this conversation.
No, I'm thrilled to be on this podcast, Marco. And who knows, maybe one day I'll join your other podcast, but really honored to be with you today.
Yeah, great. So let's start with the storyteller, which is you in this case as an author of the book. And I know we are all storyteller, even when we go to a grocery store or with friends. But in this case, you actually thought about something, that how to create impact. So let's start from who you are, and then we'll talk about book and your organization as well.
Yeah, well, first of all, I love the emphasis on storytelling. In the book, which is primarily 8 steps on how to create change in our world. I use the term policy entrepreneurship to describe what's needed right now to disrupt our policymaking processes and really, turn ideas about how we can address the world's biggest issues into positive impact, right? But fundamentally, one thing I often say is whether you are an advocate, an activist, a policy entrepreneur even, really at its core, you have to be a good storyteller. To be a good advocate is to be an effective storyteller. There's no other substitute for the power of storytelling, because it's humans that move humans and it's stories that move people. But to answer your question about why I'm here and why I wrote the book, I think I can actually address that with a story. And, in the book, I actually talk about stories of why. One of my good friends growing up at school actually said it's not what or how that make people interested, but why they do something, right? And so let me just outline my why for why I wrote the book, and why I do what I do. Growing up in Australia, I grew up in Perth, which is the most isolated city in the world, in the southwest of that great big continent. I wasn't great at sport, which in Australia is kind of like blasphemy, right? Because Australia loves sport. We idolize our sporting heroes, but I was not that guy. I was not great at sport. And so, when we used to play Aussie rules football, right, which is kind of similar to Gaelic football, if any of your listeners are into that, from Ireland, but, you have this long oval type ball. And I would go and kick this ball at school. And I would just hope that the ball would go in the right direction from which I kicked it, let alone score a goal, right? And inevitably, because I'd be so self-conscious about everyone watching, I would kick the ball and it would somehow do something weird, like fly in the opposite direction, right? Everyone would laugh, right? And then we would go into these school assemblies, right? And we always had these motivational speakers who were either Olympic gold medalists, professional footballers. It was always seemed to me like the motivational speaker was a sporting hero, right? And so I'd be sat there listening to this great hero talk about how they were so good at sport and how anyone could do it. And it was completely unrelatable to me in the audience. There I was, this kind of bookish, nerdy guy, wasn't good at sport, considered a loser in many respects. And I'd be like, yeah, it's all well and good for you to talk up there about winning medals because you've already done this. How can I do that? And I just could not see myself in that story. And, I reflected, the reason why I tell that story is, since founding Global Citizen over a decade and a half ago, some of your listeners may have heard of Global Citizen, some of them may not, and they can easily look up what Global Citizen does. But in its essence, it's a movement now of 12 million members around the world. It works with some of the biggest artists in the world to create change. And indeed, it's helped ignite over 33 million citizen actions, and it's helped unlock over $40 billion to help improve and touch the lives of more than 1 billion people around the planet, working with some incredible partners, right? Huge, huge impact. But I would often get emails or messages on social media from high school students, university students, Rotarians, and they would all be asking, how do I do something similar? How do I campaign on an issue? And I didn't want people to take the impression or have the impression that in order to create change or move policy, they had to go out and create this huge organization, hire all these people, fundraise, because that can be incredibly daunting and impenetrable. So in the same way there was as that kid at high school, struggling to find someone to relate to, I was like, okay, let me write a book, right, for anyone who asks me, how do I create change? That gives them a start, right? And so the book, it outlines these 8 steps. It doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but in the great words of Eleanor Roosevelt, who once said, former First Lady of the US, the way to begin is to begin. That's what the book is about. It's a place to get started, and it's a place to begin. And it's really for anyone, whether you're a cultural icon like Taylor Swift, a business executive, or an everyday citizen. And so that's why I kind of came up with the book and wrote it in that way.
That's cool. That's a great story, and I agree. I mean, I think it's a Chinese proverb that says, any long trip start with one step, which is, and sometimes I agree. I mean, you look at all these people that are like, all right, they're influencing a lot of people that got, especially now in our social media era and age. It's like, I got nothing, what am I going to do? So sometimes you're so scared there's either all or nothing, and you end up doing nothing. So before we actually talk about maybe these first steps for the people that are interested in that, I'm curious, what was your first step? So you're this kid here, you're listening to sports icon, and I don't see myself. Like, what was the fact that maybe if I cannot be them, I can be myself and still make change? Like, what was your first, campaign, your first action that you took?
It was interesting. I wasn't great at school in many respects, and I wasn't great at sport, as I said, but I also, for much of my early years at school, wasn't great at academics either. I would routinely be ranked bottom of the class. And then one day, I'm not sure. Everyone would know this movie, at least those who were alive, over 20 years ago. But the movie Gladiator came out with Russell Crowe, right? Yeah, many people know that movie. And we had to do this in-class essay, and I wrote about running gladiators. I got home. There was a message on the answer machine. My mum played it to me. It was my teacher at the time telling my mum that somehow remarkably Michael had topped the class of that one
wow.
essay. And he really came in the next day and he goes, I think there's more to you than meets the eye. Challenged me to be more than what I had ever before aspired to. You know, one of my friends said to me, you know, sometimes when people set so low expectations of us, we live down to those expectations rather than live up. And I had been doing that up until that point. As I was finishing high school my last year and starting university, suddenly I had everyone telling me, oh, Michael, you're suddenly so smart. You're like doing all these great things. Suddenly you're top of the class. But in Australia, we have this term, never to have tickets on yourself, right? Which is basically never to assume that like all of your achievements are entirely down to your natural gifted talents alone, right? And so I was always conscious for these opportunities, like that fantastic teacher, and very grateful. And so as I learned about the world and I learned what was going on and just the inequities around the world and the fact millions of children, you know, who probably were far smarter than I was, you know, had all of this great potential, but because they maybe didn't have access to a great teacher, didn't have access to education, you know, I thought that was an incredible injustice. And so my first campaign was actually just a charitable endeavor. Like I started honestly, fun. I'm very good at asking people to do stuff. That's one of my gifts. And so honestly, I went around with my mum, actually, the shopping center close to my high school. And I just started asking them, hey, I'm going to do a quiz night at my old school. Would you donate gifts? And so we had all of these great gifts donated, you know, everything you could imagine. And I went literally to everyone. I think I even went into McDonald's and said, can you give me, and they gave me some vouchers.
Give me a burger or something.
Something for people. And we ended up raising $1,000. And this went towards helping to build schools in Timor-Leste, East Timor, which is just about half an hour's flight from the north of Australia, but at the time was one of the poorest countries and youngest countries in the world, for Papua New Guinea. So that was incredible. And then in my summers and winters at university, I got to travel to these countries, right? And so I'd volunteer, went to India, went to Bangladesh. And, you know, as we're looking at these schools that was in part built through some of the funds that we raised through these charitable endeavors like quiz nights, movie nights, suddenly I realized, oh, gee, there's a lot of poverty here, a lot of kids that don't have access to school. How many quiz nights are we going to have to do to meet this need? And the truth is you can't, right? Like ending extreme poverty is, you know, it's $1 billion problem, right? It's going to take a lot of funds to genuinely meet the need, a lot of investment. And so that's really where I got involved in what I would say campaigning for more structural change. So, you know, we often say at Global Citizen that systemic problems require systemic solutions. And, you know, what's the best way to elevate those solutions? Well, it's through movement building, it's through social movements. And one of the first campaigns I got involved in, you asked me first policy campaign, you know, was actually around polio eradication, which is this ancient debilitating disease that's long since been eradicated in America, in Australia. But how I found out about polio, and this is another story, but just indulge me one quick second, is
sure.
I was
we're here.
I was invited to be part of this Rotary Club in Australia, and they gave me a scholarship while I was at university. Rotary has more than 1.4 million members around the world. They do incredible work. And so I went down to this local club, went for a coffee with the gentleman who had founded it, who was sponsoring. He was almost 80 years old. His name was David Goldstone. Met him for coffee, and he said, let me tell you about polio. And he told me, he said, I'll tell you about my friend John. Tells me this story about how in the 50s in Australia, his friend John, fit, you know, young 21-year-old, very healthy, is walking down the main street in Sydney and suddenly just collapses, right? Wakes up a few days later in a medical bed in a hospital, and he's paralyzed from the waist down. And in front of him is standing the chief medical officer, who tells him, John, you'll never walk again. And John replied with these 3 words, yes, I will. And David recounted to me over this coffee how his friend John slowly recovered the ability to walk over many painful, excruciating weeks, months, years. He never recovered the full use of his leg, like John, when he had his kids come up to him or his grandkids later in life saying, Daddy, Daddy, lift me up. He couldn't. He said, I can't do that. But he was able to found a successful business. And then he went on to actually give back to eradicating this disease, polio. When in Australia, for much of its existence, it had used the British pound. And when it switched to the dollar, all of the pennies left at the mint where they produced this, John got all of these pennies together. He stamped the story of polio in the back, and then he sold them and he called it Pennies for Polio. I think he raised about $100,000. And so David's telling me a story, and I'm like, wow, okay. Can I meet John? Like, this is incredible. Like, I want to find out more and learn how I can help. And then suddenly David, that whole time, he suddenly had a tear in his eye. And he said, Michael, I've been lying to you. It's just so hard. And I'm like, what do you mean? Is John real? Does he exist? What's not right? Anyway, in that moment, David literally pulled out the chair next to him, and he put his leg on the chair, lifted up his trouser leg. Oh. And he revealed a caliper, which is, I realized up to that point he had a limp when he walked, and a caliper was what many polio survivors had to walk. And he said, it wasn't John who collapsed all those years ago. It was me. Wow. I don't need anyone's pity or anything else. I just want to get on bloody well, eradicate this disease once and for all. And with that, heavily motivated, we got together. I was at my university. Long story short, we hatched this campaign with the other founders of Global Citizen. It was our first polio campaign. We came up on the back of the envelope. We're like, we're going to ask the Australian government to contribute $50 million because that was double what they had contributed in the past. So there's like, what the heck? Let's go out with a bold ask. And long story short, again, you could write a whole book on this campaign in and of itself. We managed to convince John Legend to fly all the way to Perth for less than 24 hours. He spent more time flying than he was on the ground. We got a face-to-face meeting with the then Prime Minister of Australia, Julia Gillard. And sure enough, 6 months after that first meeting with David, we were at this press conference. David was there. We had all of those polio survivors. And the Prime Minister announced $50 million for polio eradication and convinced all these other leaders to contribute as well. And I remember walking out and asking the Prime Minister's team, why has she done this? Like, we asked him, she responded to this campaign and the momentum. And they replied with something that's always struck with me, but I think is relevant for your podcast. They said, she loved the stories, Michael. Like, yes, she got the statistics, she got the case, why we should be doing this, the moral argument, but she loved the story. She loved the stories of polio survivors like David. She loved the stories of Rotarians who were fundraising to raise money for polio. And she loved the story of, in many cases, on the front lines in Pakistan and Afghanistan, of these incredible heroes, mostly women, who go door to door, often at great risk, and convince people to accept the vaccine. And she said she loves all of those stories. And that's really part of the reason why she got involved. And there's so many of these little stories that year. Like, we found out that actually it was an Australian who started the whole effort to eradicate polio. We got in touch with him, Sir Clem Renouve. We found out the Queen, she was coming to Australia that year for what ended up being her last trip. And we found out her first trip, she had to stay in a boat off the coast of Australia because of a polio epidemic that had hit it. And we convinced her to put polio. She spoke about the great challenges of polio. So anyway, I think that just shows you the power of the story. And one message I stress in the book is, if you don't have networks, you don't have access, you don't have experience, expertise in certain areas, all of that can be overcome with a great, clear idea and a powerful narrative and story. Because if you can have a powerful story as to why and how an idea should be implemented, you'll find that people will come from all around to support you in bringing that idea to fruition.
Well, you're making my podcast job very, very easy because you are a good storyteller. You have great story, and it made me kind of emotional when you were, announcing that the guy you were talking to was that. I almost like kind of like the finale of a Hollywood movie, and you were part of that. So that's great, and I loved like how you accepted challenges, and you kind of like now in the book totally empowering everybody to do this. So while I would love to hear more story, I want to hear about an example of some of these strategy, like 8 actionable strategies that people can find in the book. Because a lot of people may think like, okay, great, I'm listening to Michael, he's a great storyteller. The same way you were listening to a football player and be like, yeah, okay, easy for you to say, you're already there. So let's bring it back to how somebody can start, it can get to be a global citizen or make a difference in any other way in their community.
Yeah, no, it's a great question and very, very fair to use my stories against me to hold me accountable. That in itself is a good example of advocacy, right? What you just did. I love it.
I'll become a global citizen.
So look, the book, I make the case that, to be an effective advocate, or what I call policy entrepreneur, which I like that term because, I think what we need is more entrepreneurship, more people involved in the policy making process beyond government officials, right? So across these 8 steps, I say people need to be a visionary, they need to be a diplomat, and they need to be an implementer. But looking at the first step, one is to be very clear on what your goal is that you want to change, right? What is that idea? And it sounds very obvious, I know, but often I will meet people who want to launch this campaign. Maybe it's to end homelessness. Maybe it's to end deforestation. And often their campaign, and sometimes they've raised vast amounts of money to actually run a big marketing campaign. Often they've, already got supporters on board. But what I've noticed is they've focused the whole campaign on the problem and raise an awareness of the problem. And, especially now, that's not going to achieve much other than getting more people to know about the problem. But in doing that without solutions, you just risk almost leading people down a path towards more apathy, more indifference, and ultimately more anger. And so I take my readers for a process of how do you actually identify what a good goal is, right? And my point is often you don't have to come up with the idea yourself. Good ideas can come from anywhere, but it's how do you actually access those ideas and find them and then know when you've got a clear idea or a clear solution to a problem. So yes, you need to have a problem to begin with. You need to know what you're trying to address. But then what is that solution that you are advocating for? And I use the SMART criteria, right? And I use examples, what is specific, what is measurable, what is achievable, what is relevant, what is time bound. But, to give an example, and I interviewed many incredible advocates from the book, many of them grassroots advocates, not just up here working on big, lofty ideals. But to give you an example, one of the women I interviewed was, she's called Freddie Reese, right? She founded this nonprofit called Unchained at Last, which is focused on ending child marriage in America. And her story is she, at the age of 19, I think it was, she was living in a fairly conservative religious community, but she found herself in a situation of forced marriage, right? She managed to escape that situation. And then she was like, I don't want other girls going through that. And so initially, honestly, she would be going back to the community she would grow up in. And her, honestly, like her actions initially were just like, how can I get kids who are forced into marriage, often, kids as young as 12 or 13, like under 18 years old, how can I rescue them from this situation, right? And you know what she found in trying to rescue kids is that there were actually legal loopholes in many states in America that permitted children to get married under the age of 18 if they had parental consent and maybe it was justified on religious grounds. And so she realized, I'm not going to be able to solve this issue by just tackling this one child at a time. I need to address that loophole, right? And she started, like, when she first got started, she started with one state, and she just started going out. Once she had a clear goal, she was like, okay, I know what this loophole is now. I know that if I close it, this is how I'm going to end child marriage across this country. You need to start with the law. And once she had that clarity, the problem to the solution to the problem, she found that state legislators, people she would meet with, were ready to support because they didn't even know about the solution, right? They didn't know this existed. They didn't know it was something so simple. And, she started this campaign, maybe a little over 10 years ago. And she's already managed to end child marriage in 10 states across America. And her goal is to end it in all 50 states by 2030, right? And so I use other examples like that. How do you come up with solid goals? One of the areas I also talk about, though, is how to tell a good story, right? How to know your audience. To your point, I think we can all be good storytellers if we just focus sometimes on our audience and understand what's going to move them. And I think in every area of life, not just policy advocacy, I think storytelling can help us bridge divides, build credibility, build trust. But there's some of the advice I give on how to tell good stories is, I meet too many campaigners or advocates and even leaders of huge organizations. They will walk in, they will get their target audience in front of them, right? And it might be great. I've got someone paying attention to me. And then they will quickly lose that audience's interest because they would just give them a litany of statistics, of facts. And I think in our society today, too many people focus on being right, and they focus on winning an argument rather than how people feel. One of the best pieces of advice I got early on, where I was trying to, smash someone over the head with all of these statistics to convince them. Someone said, remember, it's not about winning the argument. It's about how people feel. That's what you need to focus on, because that's what people remember, is how you made them feel after that meeting. And so, some examples, I talk about how people can come up with their own stories of why. And often it just starts with asking yourself some questions and then writing the answers, right? Why are you here? Preempt it, because often, especially when you're trying to persuade someone to back your campaign, they'll be looking at you with skeptical like glazes in their eye. And until you answer why you're here, why you're championing this issue, they won't 100% trust anything that comes out of your mouth, because they might say, are you here because you're getting paid? Is this just a job? What's this to you? Why should I trust you, right? And then the second thing I talk about is the power of how, because I think especially in our society, once you've got that trust and people, understand your why, making sure you quickly give them a solution, right? And I talk about how to address that, how to make it relatable. Again, not just talking about the problem. And so, again, list examples, of effective storytellers. One is this incredible activist in the Pacific, from Samoa. She's in her early 20s, and Rihanna's her name, and I use her as an example because her message, I've found, even though she's from this island, which has a lot of problems, it's on the front lines of climate change. In many ways, its future as a small island nation is an existential crisis right now. But she still manages to always lead, this is how we're addressing that, and these are the solutions. And so, the final thing I talk about is bringing it back to stories. Is once you've succeeded in something, even if you haven't necessarily achieved everything you want to achieve in a campaign, even if it's an incremental milestone, make sure you share that story with others. Because right now, with so much misinformation, with so much distrust that exists in our world, one of the things that people do trust a lot more is stories from their networks, right? From their friends, from their family, from their circles of trust. And when you hear a story about someone getting a response or taking an action, that's one of the most powerful motivators to push someone to action. And so just one last story on that point, the polio campaign I was telling earlier, once we had achieved that $50 million, there was a write-up, a journalist wrote a story about that campaign and my involvement in it, right? I got this message from a 9-year-old girl and her mother, Josie was her name, and they invited me over to their house, met them, had tea, coffee, biscuits, all of that stuff. And they had been on a recent trip where they had seen these endangered elephants. And literally, Josie and her mother was like, we want to start a campaign to save the elephants, right? And I helped her form her own campaign. She got her whole school assembly on board. She convinced a senator to table her petition in the Senate of Australia. She convinced all these people to get involved. And then lo and behold, she was sharing that story on radio later that year. And I've often thought, I wonder how many other kids might have been inspired to launch their own campaign after hearing her story. So, it's hopefully that gives a little bit of insight, but as you can see, the power of storytelling and how to go about telling stories is a key thread all the way through.
Yeah, well, my head is going because I process. I don't have Q&A, as you know, because you don't have any question prior to meet with me. So I kind of go with what you say, and you say so many relevant things, like so many beautiful story things that I agree that all of a sudden I'm like, okay, I'm gonna ask this, nope, I'm gonna ask this, nope, I'm gonna ask this. So instead of doing that, I'm gonna try to maybe summarize a couple of things that I really got out of this, which is, it seems to me everything started with passion, right? I don't know if that could be something like, I'm sure you share that, like, don't pick a campaign just because it's popular. Pick a campaign because you actually do care, because you've seen the elephant, right? Because you met with the guy, because you had that disease, and use that power to fire your intention in a way. But then you gotta learn it. Some people are natural storytellers. They come natural maybe because as kids they read a lot of books, maybe come from a family of storytellers, and some other they may need a little bit more help with that. And I think that if you can read something where you have few advice, and that's definitely a help. So, I always say we're all made of stories. We just don't realize that sometimes, right? Yeah. So it's kind of like a way to pause and stop and say, look, there is a strategy behind it. If you need it, if it comes natural, sure, get the guitar and play because you're that good. But otherwise, you can learn, and you can learn how to write music and all of that. But it's incredible. You work with so many famous people, and that's probably, is that like another lesson in the book on how to maybe bring it to, in a way, I don't know, it's not just on yourself, but if you can get somebody that can help you to represent your story and you can move that person, it's either a grant or money, but it can also be somebody that just get on stage and say, hey, million people listening to me right now, here's what we can do. And that's powerful, especially nowadays. Do you want to connect these last few minutes, maybe, is it like the role of social media, for example? You said something like, it's not about winning the argument. I feel like on social media it's all about winning the argument, and then nobody really wins because there's people against, people pro, and again, okay, but how are we going to solve this problem, right? Do you feel social media? I mean, are you guys using in your organization social media in the right way? You think there is a right and a wrong way?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I also liked what you were just talking about before, about everyone has a good story within them, and I just wanted to underscore that point because one of the barriers I often find to people getting involved or feeling like they can speak on these issues is that they feel, okay, I don't have a humanitarian story, right? Like, you know, often, you hear founders talk about, establishing an org, and one of their stories for motivating them is maybe they went overseas, they volunteered, and they had this huge, epiphany that they were going to save the world.
The origin story. I call it the origin story.
Exactly. And I think you can actually find incredible origin stories, even in activities that might seem mundane, right? And so when I was challenged a few years ago to think through my why, again, I thought, well, I didn't even leave Australia until the age of 18. I wasn't volunteering. I don't have that great origin story. I just kind of started doing this because it felt like the right thing to do. And then as I dug deeper, I connected it to motivation and that feeling of being a loser at school, being told I weren't going to amount to anything, and then the difference teachers made in my life. And I was like, okay, well, that's my why. And that became the story about it, right? And so I just wanted to underscore that, because often I meet too many people who feel like they don't have that story, and actually we do. We just haven't expressed it or articulated it or identified it. But going back to your question on social media, you're absolutely right. In the book, I talk about the dopamine high that comes from solidarity posting right now. And it's the idea that, whenever there's a crisis that occurs, everyone's quick to post on social media in solidarity, right? And then soon business goes back to usual. And in fact, those who did post, end up criticizing those that didn't post, etc. It becomes this whole vicious cycle, right? And we get into unhealthy habits such as policing the social media of others, checking if people have posted in solidarity, etc. Right? There's all of these examples you can point to, but the issue is these sorts of activities, by declaring you support something, might leave us feeling right, righteous, certain, and safe, which is a great phrase from a great book called Breaking the Gridlock that came out a few years ago. But it actually doesn't go towards addressing the issues. And so, I know in my experience at Global Citizen, for instance, we always believe in impact over ideology, and we ban the phrase awareness raising, right? We're always focused on clear solutions. We won't launch a campaign without having a clear impact. And, we're not going to get people enraged on social media just for the sake of it, unless there's a way of channeling that rage into a concrete action. So, often it's like, how do I actually turn the talk into action? And to your point on artists, I often find that they're looking for these solutions because they have all of these fans that they've got involved. And often the reason why I end up working with a lot of artists now on their advocacy, people like Idris Elba, Coldplay, etc., whether it's through our work at Global Citizen, or often they're working on their own campaigns and they ask us for advice, is they don't just want to go to their fans and ask them for money, right? Because they have millions of fans. Many of them might be young people. Many of them may not have the disposable income to donate. And so they're looking for ways to get involved, but isn't just, hey, post this on your social media. And so often, it's about identifying campaigns that's really going to move people to action and get them engaged. To give you one example, in June last year, we were working with the Prime Minister of Barbados. I tell this story in the book, and she's an incredible storyteller. People should look her up. Mia Motley, Google her, look at it on YouTube. But the short end of it, we were convincing all of these world leaders, right, to unlock funding for countries like hers on the front lines of the climate crisis. And as these leaders were due to meet in Paris, you had the president of the World Bank, etc., we managed to convince Rihanna to actually tweet president of the World Bank with all of her fans. And it wasn't just like, I'm standing in solidarity with countries on the climate crisis, this is all really bad. It was actually very, very targeted to Janet Yellen, president of the World Bank. And it was like, here's a measure they can do, which is not going to cost much to, say, American taxpayers, but is going to unlock money for countries struggling whenever there's hurricanes, extreme weather events, and all of their fans got behind it. And then when we were successful, the World Bank actually replied and said, okay, we'll do that. We went back to all of these people who had taken action, and we actually saw people saying, wow, okay, my actions did make a difference. It did get involved. And so that is always the challenge, is like trying to identify those solutions and identify how we could get involved. And just one last point, since you asked on this question, is I as part of the book tour, I encountered this incredible researcher and group at New York University, and they had actually done these studies across 60 countries, 60,000 participants. And one thing she found is, okay, if you want people to share stuff on social media, fine, give them all of the bad stuff about climate change, tell them how bad the world's doing doom and gloom messaging. And sure, lo and behold, that's the best way to get people to share. However, the downside of that, it also decreased people's support for meaningful policy action, right? Because it made people think, we were on a fatalistic path, there was no hope, we may as well give up. And then and the best action on the reverse of this, that on average increased support for policy action, meaningful action, the idea that we can change things, was actually getting people to write a letter to a future child who may not even be born yet, but who would be around in 2055, dealing with the impacts of climate change, and to actually write how are we taking action now? What actions are we taking? And the action of expressing this in a letter was found to increase support for meaningful policy change. So I put those two actions side by side because, we think there's not consequences or negative consequences. Oh, it's just a social media post, etc., getting people to share, but it can be very counterproductive.
Well, you just gave me the perfect close in here, because I see that the social media is easy, right? I mean, you just go there, you retweet, maybe you just read the headline and you just put your little heart on it. Chances are, and I was saying everybody, but chances are most people don't even really read through that article, listen to the entire podcast or whatever. So it's not really storytelling, it's just like amplifying. But the idea of writing a letter, now that you're becoming a storyteller for real. Even if it's a short one, you're telling a story to somebody, you get into that mindset of really thinking about what you're going to write. And that's brilliant. I mean, you made the unique, and again, you show people that they can tell a story and make a difference. So I love that. I think people will have a lot to think about here, which is my goal. I like to make people think, and then eventually act, but that's more your job, I guess. So I want them to act by, after they think about what we talked about, to go and check out on your book. All the links will be on the notes for this podcast, for your social media if you want to share it, and of course for Global Citizen and for your book. Again, From Ideas to Impact, a playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world. Great conversation. I would love to have you back and keep going anytime. Let's stay in touch, and really appreciate it. Great stories.
And I don't want to sound like I'm negative on social media, because I'm not. But to your point, where a good ask of social media would be, and maybe it's an artist who can tweet this on their platform, is to ask people through social media to write that letter, for instance. And that would be far more constructive than just sharing more of the bad news. So I just want to clarifr that it's about how we use the tools. Yeah,
when
exactly.
I talk about technology, is how you use it. You can't just, and I'm actually glad that we went an entire podcast without touching on generative AI. So there you go. That's for another story. For the
other podcast.
Mike, thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Everybody stay tuned, subscribe, take action. If you have an idea, just try to make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Audio Signals with Marco Ciappelli. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then add this show to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and share the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to connect your brand to our conversations and our audience, visit itspmagazine.com to learn how to sponsor one or more of our shows. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey.